The tropical sun hangs directly overhead in the clear sky above Rabaul on August 7th, 1943, turning the cockpit of Lieutenant Edward Carlson's F-4U Corsair into a greenhouse where sweat soaks through his flight suit and makes the control stick slippery in his gloved hands. He flies at 18,000 feet, alone, separated from his section during the confused melee that erupted 20 minutes earlier when his squadron bounced a formation of Japanese bombers and their escorts. The engagement has scattered friendly aircraft across 50 miles of sky, leaving individual pilots to navigate home independently, to evade enemy fighters still searching for isolated targets, to survive through skill and luck in airspace, where Japanese air groups operate with the confidence of defending their own territory. Carlson scans the empty sky, checking his 6 o'clock position reflexively every few seconds, maintaining the situational awareness that keeps pilots alive when support is absent and threats can appear from any direction. Then his peripheral vision catches movement above and behind, 6 dark shapes dropping from altitude where they have been waiting, where the sun has concealed them until they commit to the attack. 6 AXM-0 fighters diving in a coordinated formation that announces experienced pilots executing textbook tactics. The mathematics are immediate and unforgiving. 6 against 1, attackers with altitude and speed advantage. A lone defender whose options have collapsed to desperate measures. Standard doctrine says run if faster, but zeros are more maneuverable at combat speeds. Standard doctrine says dive if able, but coordinated attacks will position interceptors to cut off escape routes. What Carlson does instead is something his instructor pilots told him was impossible, a maneuver they insisted would either fail to execute or would kill him through structural failure or loss of control, a technique he has practiced alone during unauthorized training flights because he believed the instructors were wrong about what the Corsair could tolerate. In the next 15 seconds, that impossible maneuver will save his life, will demonstrate that sometimes survival requires attempting what doctrine says cannot be done, and will prove that the difference between possible and impossible is often simply the difference between what has been tried and what has been assumed. To understand why Carlson believed he could execute a maneuver his instructors called impossible, one must first comprehend what those instructors feared, and why their fears were simultaneously justified and conservative. The F-4U Corsair was among the most powerful and heavily built fighters produced during World War II, designed around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine that generated over 2,000 horsepower, constructed with structural strength that allowed the aircraft to tolerate stresses that would tear apart lighter fighters. But that power and strength came with handling characteristics that made the Corsair difficult to fly, that killed pilots during training at rates that concerned Navy leadership, that resulted in the aircraft initially being rejected for carrier operations because of visibility and landing characteristics that made approach and touchdown dangerously unpredictable. One of the Corsair's most dangerous characteristics was its behavior during high-speed stalls, particularly in rolling maneuvers where one wing might stall before the other, creating sudden and violent rolling motions that could develop into inverted spins from which recovery was difficult or impossible. Flight instructors emphasized smooth control inputs, warned against abrupt maneuvers at high angles of attack, explicitly prohibited rolling maneuvers during slow-speed flight because the risk of departure from controlled flight was considered unacceptably high. Carlson had come to naval aviation through aeronautical engineering background that made him analyze, rather than simply accept the limitations his instructors described. Before flight training, he had studied at MIT, had taken courses in structural mechanics and aerodynamics, understood the mathematical relationships that governed how airframes responded to control inputs and aerodynamic forces. When instructors told him the Corsair could not perform certain maneuvers, he heard them saying that pilots should not attempt those maneuvers, rather than that the aircraft was physically incapable of executing them. The distinction mattered. An aircraft that should not do something might still be able to do it if a pilot understood the forces involved, managed energy state precisely, and executed with timing and coordination that most pilots could not maintain under stress. The maneuver Carlson had been practicing, what he called the high G barrel roll reversal, was explicitly prohibited in Corsair training because it combined high angle of attack with rolling motion in ways that instructors believed would induce uncontrollable departure from controlled flight. But Carlson's analysis suggested that if executed with sufficient speed and precise control inputs, the maneuver should be survivable, that the Corsair's structural strength and power could tolerate forces that would destroy lighter aircraft. The theory behind the impossible maneuver was based on understanding how pursuing fighters coordinated their attacks and where their coordination became vulnerability. 6 Zeros attacking one Corsair would position themselves to cut off escape routes, would sequence their firing passes so that when one attacker overshot another, would be positioned to continue engagement, would rely on numerical superiority to ensure that the target faced continuous threat from angles it could not defend simultaneously. Their coordination assumed the target would maneuver conventionally, would turn, dive, or climb in ways that allowed attackers to predict future position and position themselves accordingly. But if the target could reverse its flight path in timescales shorter than attackers could adjust to, if it could transition from flying one direction to flying the opposite direction in seconds, rather than the tens of seconds conventional reversals required, the coordination that made multiple attackers effective would become confusion that made them interfere with each other rather than support each other's attacks. The sound of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 at maximum power became the symbolic element that defined what the impossible maneuver represented. That thunderous hammering roar of 18 cylinders producing maximum power, supercharger compressed intake, mixing with exhaust to create sound that announced raw mechanical force being applied without reservation, without the throttle management that characterized normal operations. That sound was not the measured rumble of cruise power or the confident growl of combat power, but rather the full-throated bellow of an engine pushed to its absolute limits, of machinery being asked to deliver every horsepower it could generate, because survival depended on performance that left nothing in reserve. For the Japanese pilots diving to attack, that sound, if they could have heard it over their own engines and the wind noise of high-speed flight, would have announced that their target was not attempting to flee or evade, but rather was preparing to do something that required maximum power, something their doctrine and experience had not prepared them to encounter. The execution began at 11:47 hours as the 6 Zeros completed their dive from altitude and began spreading into the attack formation that would allow them to engage sequentially, their positioning reflecting the practiced coordination of pilots who had flown together for months and understood each other's tactics without requiring radio coordination. Carlson had perhaps 8 seconds before the lead Zero would be in firing range. 8 seconds to initiate the maneuver that would either save him or kill him, depending on whether his analysis of what the Corsair could tolerate was correct, or whether his instructor's warnings about impossible maneuvers were justified. He advanced the throttle to maximum power, felt the R-2800 respond with surge of acceleration that pushed him back into his seat, maintained level flight while the engine built power and airspeed climbed through 300 miles per hour. Then, at the moment when the lead zero was 4 seconds from firing range, Carlson pulled back hard on the stick while simultaneously rolling left, combining vertical pull with rolling motion in exactly the configuration his instructors had prohibited. The Corsair responded by doing what aerodynamic theory predicted and what instructors feared. It began a barrel roll while simultaneously pitching up into a climb so steep it approached vertical. The combination of maneuvers generated G-forces that grayed Carlson's vision, that made the aircraft shudder as airflow over the wings approached separation, that stressed the airframe in ways it was designed to tolerate, but that pilots were instructed never to impose. But Carlson maintained the control inputs, held the stick back and left, kept maximum power applied, flying the aircraft through the region of the performance envelope where instructors said control would be lost and departure would be inevitable. The Corsair did not depart. It continued through the barrel roll, continued climbing, and at the apex of the maneuver, when it was pointed nearly straight up with velocity decaying rapidly, Carlson reversed the rolling motion, snapped the stick right while maintaining back pressure, caused the aircraft to reverse its roll direction while still climbing vertically. The effect on the attacking Zeros was immediate and catastrophic to their coordination. The lead pilot, expecting his target to either dive away or turn horizontally, found the Corsair executing a maneuver he had never seen, climbing vertically while rolling in a pattern that made prediction of its flight path impossible. He adjusted his attack angle, attempting to lead the target's motion, but the Corsair reversed its roll at the moment when he committed to the firing solution, putting it in a position his lead calculation had not anticipated. He overshot without firing, climbed away to avoid collision, his attack run wasted. The second Zero, positioned to engage if the target broke right, found the Corsair breaking upward instead, climbing into a region of sky where the Zero's lighter wing loading and lower power-to-weight ratio made it sluggish, where the Corsair's massive engine and structural strength allowed it to maintain control at speeds where the Zero was approaching stall. The second pilot attempted to follow but found his aircraft shuddering on the edge of departure and had to push forward on his stick to recover flying speed rather than continuing pursuit. The transformation in the engagement's dynamics was that the 6 coordinated attackers had become 6 individual pilots trying to figure out where their target had gone and how it had gotten there. The barrel roll reversal had taken approximately 12 seconds from initiation to completion, 12 seconds during which the Corsair had transitioned from flying straight and level to climbing nearly vertically, had reversed direction by approximately 160 degrees, had changed altitude by over 3,000 feet, and had positioned itself above and behind where the attacking Zeros had expected it to be. The maneuver had not made Carlson faster or more maneuverable than his opponents. The Zeros remained superior in turning performance and could outclimb the Corsair in sustained climbs. But the maneuver had disrupted the attackers' coordination by doing something they had not anticipated, by moving through space in ways their tactical planning had not accounted for, by converting their numerical advantage into liability as individual pilots maneuvered to avoid collision with each other rather than coordinating to maintain pressure on their target. The Japanese pilots, recovering from the disruption the impossible maneuver had created, attempted to regroup and establish a new attack pattern, but Carlson did not wait for them to reorganize. As the barrel roll reversal completed and his aircraft reached the top of its vertical climb, with airspeed decaying towards stall, he pushed forward on the stick and rolled inverted, converting potential energy back into kinetic energy, diving away from the scattered Zeros at an angle they could not immediately follow, because they were still sorting out their positions relative to each other. By the time the Japanese formation leader re-established visual contact with the Corsair and attempted to coordinate pursuit, Carlson had opened the distance to over 2 miles, had descended to an altitude where his aircraft's power advantage was overwhelming, and was accelerating away at speeds the Zeros could not match in level flight. The engagement was over. 6 attackers with perfect positioning and coordinated tactics had failed to achieve even a single firing pass on a lone defender, because that defender had executed a maneuver their doctrine said was impossible, and that their experience had never encountered. The resistance Carlson encountered when he described the barrel roll reversal to his squadron mates after returning to base reflected institutional skepticism that bordered on disbelief. The maneuver he described violated everything Corsair pilots were taught about safe handling, combined prohibited control inputs in ways that should have caused departure from controlled flight, and achieved results that seemed too effective to be credible. Squadron pilots who heard the account suspected either exaggeration or that Carlson had misunderstood what actually happened, that adrenaline and combat stress had distorted his perception of events, that 6 coordinated Zeros would not have been defeated by a single maneuver that took 12 seconds to execute. The skepticism persisted until Carlson demonstrated the barrel roll reversal during a training flight, with the squadron commander observing from another aircraft positioned to watch. The demonstration confirmed that the maneuver was exactly as Carlson had described: violent, disorienting, executed at the edge of the aircraft's performance envelope, but controllable if executed with precise timing and sufficient power. The transformation in how Marine Corsair squadrons understood their aircraft's capabilities following Carlson's demonstration was gradual but significant. Officially, the barrel roll reversal was never incorporated into standard training because it was too difficult for average pilots to execute safely, because attempting it without sufficient skill would result in exactly the departures from controlled flight that instructors feared, because the risk of training accidents was considered too high to justify teaching a maneuver that worked only when executed perfectly. But unofficially, word spread through Corsair squadrons that the aircraft could perform maneuvers doctrine said were impossible, that the prohibited regions of the performance envelope were survivable if entered with understanding and skill, that instructors' warnings about impossible maneuvers were conservative guidance rather than absolute physical limits. Experienced pilots began experimenting during training flights, exploring what the Corsair could actually do rather than what they had been told it could do, discovering that the aircraft's strength and power allowed maneuvers that lighter, less powerful fighters could not attempt. The 15 seconds during which Carlson executed the impossible maneuver and escaped 6 coordinated attackers were 15 seconds that challenged fundamental assumptions about what was tactically viable in aerial combat. The barrel roll reversal worked not because it was a superior maneuver in abstract terms. It was energy-intensive, disorienting, and risky even when executed correctly, but because it operated outside the tactical expectations of opponents whose doctrine and experience had not prepared them for maneuvers that combined vertical and rolling motion at angles of attack, where most aircraft lost control. The Japanese pilots were not incompetent or poorly trained. They were experienced professionals executing textbook tactics against a target that refused to respond in textbook ways, that did something their understanding of aircraft capabilities said should be impossible, that survived through executing the impossible rather than attempting conventional escapes that their numerical superiority and positioning would have defeated. The sound of that R-2800 at maximum power throughout the maneuver, that thunderous roar that announced machinery being pushed to absolute limits, became the audible representation of what separated those who accepted limitations from those who tested them. That sound was not recklessness or disregard for safety, but rather calculated application of maximum capability when partial measures would have been insufficient, when survival required extracting every ounce of performance the aircraft could provide, and accepting the risks that maximum performance entailed. For Carlson, flying through the barrel roll reversal with vision graying from G-forces and airframe, shuddering from aerodynamic stresses, that sound was reassurance that the engine was delivering the power needed to complete the maneuver, that the aircraft was responding to control inputs rather than departing into uncontrolled flight, that his analysis of what was possible had been correct, and his instructors' warnings about impossibility had been conservative. And so, we return to that tropical sky above Rabaul. To Lieutenant Carlson, at 18,000 feet, with 6 zeros diving to attack, to the moment when survival requires attempting what doctrine prohibits, when standard responses guarantee failure, and only the impossible offers possibility of success. The barrel roll reversal that follows, that violent combination of vertical climb and rolling motion executed at the edge of the performance envelope, is the physical manifestation of refusing to accept limitations that others assume are absolute, of understanding that impossible often means untried rather than actually impossible, of recognizing that survival sometimes belongs to those willing to execute maneuvers that doctrine says cannot be done because doctrine assumes capabilities rather than tests them. The thunder of the R-2800 at maximum power throughout, that hammering roar of engine pushed to its limits, announces that maximum capability matters more than comfortable margins when survival depends on performance that leaves nothing in reserve, that the difference between living and dying can be measured in the willingness to use every capability the machine provides, rather than operating within the safe boundaries that training prescribes. The 6 Japanese pilots watching their coordinated attack disintegrate as their target executes a maneuver they have never encountered, climbing vertically while rolling in patterns that make prediction impossible, are experiencing what happens when assumptions about what opponents can do prove wrong, when tactical coordination based on predicting conventional responses fails because responses are unconventional, when numerical superiority becomes irrelevant because the target operates outside the tactical framework that numerical superiority was designed to exploit. Their confusion is not failure of skill or courage, but rather confrontation with possibility their training said did not exist, with a maneuver their doctrine classified as impossible. That proves itself possible through the simple fact of being executed successfully, through the American pilot flying away after 12 seconds of violence that transformed 6 coordinated attackers into 6 scattered individuals trying to understand what they witnessed. The impossible maneuver, prohibited by instructors and avoided by conventional pilots who trusted that limitations described in training were limitations that actually constrained capability, succeeds not because it is safe or recommended or approved, but because it is possible when executed with understanding of forces involved, with precise control inputs maintained under stress, with power applied without reservation at the moment when partial measures would be insufficient. And in that success lies truth about warfare and capability and the relationship between what we are told is possible and what actually is possible. that limitations are often boundaries of experience rather than boundaries of capability, that impossible is word applied to what has not been attempted rather than to what cannot be achieved, that 15 seconds of executing what doctrine prohibits can mean survival when hours of following what doctrine prescribes would guarantee failure, that the sound of an engine at maximum power is sound of capability fully utilized rather than carefully rationed, and that sometimes the most important skill is not following instructions perfectly, but rather recognizing when instructions describe safe practices for normal situations while survival requires unsafe practices for abnormal situations where safety means accepting risks that normal operations avoid, because normal operations have luxury of margins that combat eliminates. The barrel roll reversal, impossible according to instructors, lethal according to warnings, prohibited according to training doctrine, proves itself through Carlson flying home after 6 attackers failed to land single burst because their target did what their experience said could not be done, what their doctrine classified as impossible, what their tactical planning never anticipated because anticipation assumes opponents operate within known capabilities, and Carlson operated beyond those capabilities into region where impossible is revealed as simply the untested rather than the unachievable, where 12 seconds of violence at the edge of the performance envelope converts certain death into improbable survival, where the thunder of maximum power applied without reservation announces that survival belongs to those willing to use every capability their aircraft provides, even when doctrine warns against utilizing capabilities that exist beyond approved margins, beyond safe practices, beyond the comfortable boundaries where average pilots operate, and where extraordinary circumstances demand extraordinary responses that doctrine cannot anticipate. Because doctrine assumes situations that combat routinely violates through producing circumstances where following rules guarantees failure, and breaking rules offers the only possibility of success that exists in the 15 seconds between 6 coordinated attackers beginning their run and 1 defender executing the impossible maneuver that transforms coordination into confusion and numerical superiority into irrelevant advantage that cannot be exploited because the target refuses to cooperate with assumptions about how targets behave.